If Labour fail to deliver the level of change that they are promising, then I would expect to see the support for independence begin to rise.
Everybody is sick and fed up of how things are. 17 years of the SNP, 14 years of the Tories, and nothing's better.
Who poisoned the well in Scottish politics? I hate to say it, I do think it came from the nationalist cause only after the independence referendum. You guys thought, we're that close, what do we need to do to get it over the line? And at that point in time, it was to create the monster of division.
I think that's nonsense. Politics is divisive, it's people disagree, and this fundamentally again comes back to something that might and probably will bite the backside of a future Labour government.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Political Fourcast, the Scotland edition. Because no matter how boring and predictable you might be finding the election in England, here it's absolutely gripping. Because the SNP, which holds the overwhelming majority of seats here, is expected to lose seats to a resurgent Labour Party. The question is, how many? So many seats here are marginals, so predictions are hard. Scots are having to work out what change means to them. Do they, like England, switch back to Labour, or accept the pleas of the SNP that it is the party that reflects Scotland's values against a Labour government that in the end won't be that different to the Tories? So on the face of it, it's probably going to be a bad night for the SNP on July the 4th, but might it, paradoxically, end up being the best thing for the independence campaign? Support for independence has been decoupled from support for the SNP in the polls. It's still at 47%. So might a Labour government that sticks to Tory spending limits be just the launchpad the independence campaign here needs? With me to discuss all this and more, the SNP's Mhairi Black, Scottish Labour's Duncan-Glancy, and Chairman of the Scottish Conservatives, Craig Hoy. Mhairi, how bad is it going to be? Are we talking a graze, something quite painful, or a massacre?
Do you know, genuinely, I don't know. Now, from my reading of and my understanding of the polls is, so just now if support for an SNP is sitting at around, say, 30%, if that goes up to 33, 34%, that's the difference between 15 seats and 42 seats, for instance. So I think a lot of this is going to come down to not just what happens in the next fortnight, but also on the quality of the local campaigns in each different area, because, like you say, there's so many marginals that I don't think we will be able to call.
And Pam, I mean, are you primarily benefiting from the whole it's time for a change, generally, and sort of the get the Tories out feeling in Scotland?
So, well, first of all, there's not a vote being cast yet. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that, and we'll continue to fight for every vote all the way up until the 4th of July. But there's no doubt about it, people across Scotland and across the UK want to see change because they're waiting on NHS waiting lists too long. The education system in Scotland was once the envy of the world, and it's now been ruined by the SNP government in here in Scotland. We've got, as I said earlier, waiting lists which are getting bigger rather than smaller, so we're going backwards in terms of improvement there. And then we've had a Tory government that's meant we've got mortgages that are now up by £2,000. And so we're in a country right now where everybody is sick and fed up of how things are. 17 years of the SNP, 14 years of the Tories, and nothing's better.
Is that the problem, that you're the casualties of getting the Tories out? That people see you as also part of...
Well, no, I think
the establishment. I
think it's again comes back to that myth that Scotland had for years, where the only way to beat the Tories was to vote Labour, when Scotland hasn't voted Tory since 1955, and yet we've had so many Conservative governments. So there is an element of not wanting people to slip back into that sort of mindset. But on the flip side, though, there's also the point of, and I appreciate that, you know, people do want to see the back of the Tories and they do want to see change, and I would take a Labour government over a Tory government any day. But Keir Starmer's Labour certainly aren't showing that they're that much different when it comes to the big issues, whether that's due to public spending, whether it's Brexit, you name it, they're not that far apart from where the Conservatives are. So the difficulty for the SNP, I think, is not only to argue their relevance in this election, but it's also to highlight that fact that if you're really wanting change, is the Labour Party and Keir Starmer actually offering much of a change?
Craig, how's the Conservative campaign working in Scotland? Because there are realistically only a handful of seats where you're in contention? Are you sort of concentrating everything on those seats? And is it a local campaign or is it a national campaign? You know.
Well, I think what we saw from the SNP manifesto today was what I think we have come to expect. I mean, they said that page 1, line 1 of their manifesto would be about independence. And actually, it was the only thing on page 1 in very bold type that a vote for SNP is a vote for independence, not schools, not hospitals, not roads, not railways, not those life.
I think that's the point. That's why
that's fundamentally the issue that's on the table at this election. Not because we want it to be. We'd rather be focusing on public policy, but the constitutional issue is still front and centre. So it's more than a handful of seats where we're in contention. We presently hold 6. There's about 6 or 7 that we're also targeting that are in play for us. We're saying to people, if you want to beat the SNP, remove independence from the debate in Scotland, then the best way to do that is to vote Scottish Conservative in those seats and get the focus onto the people's real priorities. I mean, Pam and I sit in the Scottish Parliament, and it is deeply, deeply regrettable that this is the 25th year of devolution. And yet, rather than working together to say, how can we actually improve the quality of life for people in Scotland, we're all too often focused upon these fictitious independence white papers that come forward that nobody's reading, that are costing the taxpayer a huge amount of money. But ultimately, I think around the country, people are saying we want to move on from independence. But the SNP have put it at the heart of their manifesto, so we'll fight the election on it. But this is the election we can beat the SNP and move on to Scotland's real priorities.
When you're saying, you know, we're focusing on these fictitious independence arguments, that's because the Scottish Parliament that you sit in is having to put band-aids over so many scars that have been put across Scottish communities from the Conservative government in the UK and Westminster. Now, that's where all the money comes from.
Right, that's the point. It's because of the Conservative government. But we can get rid of this Conservative government and have a Labour government, which will do a power of good for Scotland and the rest of the UK. We don't need to wait on independence.
But
we can have that now.
Right, but what are you offering that is different from the Conservatives?
Mhairi, you don't believe that. And I know you don't, because look at the New Deal for working people. Could you see the Conservatives supporting that?
Hold on, right.
GB Energy, bringing down bills by £1,400 a year, bringing 63,000 jobs to Scotland, money for the NHS, support for schools and education.
Money for the NHS, where's that coming from?
By closing the non-dom loophole tax. I don't think you should be asking about where money's coming from when you look at your manifesto today, Mhairi.
No, this is my point, is where you're saying that we're closed at this end, right? Where the power for the NHS is devolved, but the money's not. So if we are constantly getting cuts from Westminster, which we have been, and which under a Labour government are set to continue, it doesn't matter who's in the Scottish Parliament. Hold on, let me finish. It doesn't matter who's in the Scottish Parliament, because they're still going to have a smaller and smaller budget. I
think the issue that Mhairi has to address is they keep talking about, you know, cuts from Westminster. The Scottish Government has a record block grant through the Barnett formula this year, more than ever before in real terms. And they keep talking about austerity as if that's the cause of the problems in Scotland. The real austerity in Scotland that has really fed through to our communities is the austerity in Scottish local government. And that was year after year after year of SNP cuts to council budgets. And I think, you know, Johnson, when he's talking about this ABC policy, you have to own up to the fact, Mhairi, that you've been in government in Scotland for 17 years. Now, John Swinney and Hamza Yousaf, they have their own ABC policy. A, they abdicate responsibility. B, they blame Brexit. And C, they say COVID is the cause. All of the problems that we see predate the COVID
But it's
pandemic.
blindingly obvious, looking at opinion polls, that people still blame the Conservative government in Westminster more than they blame the SNP government in Holyrood. You know, it's your record in government in London that is the real problem, and why, you know, you're in contention in a few seats, but, you know, there are some people, you know, if you look at the electoral calculus, you know, predictions, for example, you know, I mean, you could end up with 1 seat. You know, you're almost facing an extinction event.
That's not how it feels on the ground in Scotland. And I've been on enough doorsteps recently to realise that there's a kind of political microclimate in Scotland, and you can't extrapolate a national poll and put it into those constituencies. And also in 2021, the same predictions were being made by the same pollsters who said in the Scottish parliamentary elections we were going to be forced into a distant third and probably lose half of our seats. What happened in 2021 was that we secured the same record number of seats, 31 seats at Holyrood, that Ruth Davidson had delivered, and also we added 90,000.
So do you think the campaign in Scotland for the Conservatives is going better than it is for the United Kingdom?
I think the campaign in Scotland is very, very focused on what we can deliver in those communities that we represent.
Okay, well, I posed a question at the beginning of this, which is that actually, might a Labour government in Westminster be paradoxically the best thing that could possibly happen to the independence campaign? It's an odd argument, but the argument runs, you've had 14 years of Conservative prime ministers, and the SNP have been saying, well, look at what they're doing. Now along comes a Labour government. If Mhairi's right, and that Labour government doesn't transform things in Scotland and sticks to Conservative spending limits and makes cuts in unprotected departments, and is a disappointment to people in Scotland who, in many places, in the central belt at least, maybe not in rural areas, are probably a little bit to the left of people in England, doesn't that just rejuvenate the independence campaign? That gives you a great launching pad, doesn't it, Mhairi?
I mean,
you go first.
Just absolutely anything for the SNP is a reason to have another independence referendum. So it almost doesn't, whatever the outcome of this election is, they'll say it's a mandate for independence referendum, because they say it all the time, they move the goalposts. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, I don't think Mhairi's right. I don't think a Labour government will disappoint. I'm confident in our manifesto. I'm confident in our ability to grow the economy. I'm confident in our ability to bring 63,000 jobs to Scotland, to bring down NHS waiting lists, to invest in schools and education.
But a lot of your supporters are pro-independence now, aren't they? Perhaps 1 in 3 Labour voters in Scotland are now in favour of independence.
But this election is about who is going to govern the UK, and who, when we wake up...
but we're talking about the what I'm saying is more and more of them might start saying, well, we could do more.
And in some ways, we may disagree about the destination in some places, and we know that's the case. There's a plethora of views across Scotland, but what we're saying right now is there is a majority for change, and that is really clear. And anyone you've spoken to in Scotland will tell you that they're sick and tired of what they've got right now.
Craig?
But Pam, that I think just identifies one of the problems that Scottish Labour have, which is you're looking both ways. And actually, if you look at the Scottish Labour record in the Scottish Parliament, many of those very contentious pieces of legislation that came forward, for example, gender recognition reform, where were Scottish Labour? They were standing with and voting with the SNP. On the hate crimes legislation, where were Scottish Labour standing with and voting with the SNP? On those rent controls that have done so much damage, and which we warned about, to the housing availability and housing stock in Glasgow and Edinburgh, which means rather than rents being frozen or falling, are actually going through the roof because they're basically anti-market. Where were Scottish Labour? They were standing with and voting with the SNP. So in many respects, the Scottish Labour Party have aligned themselves with the SNP on some of those big policies. And that's because you want to try and win over some of their supporters. And that's why you can't give that definition as to where you really stand on that question of independence long term, because you still want to try and cover those SNP supporters.
Mhairi, are you looking forward to being able to say, look, we told you, neither Labour nor the Tories are the answer?
I mean, no, not looking forward, because I don't think that if what I expect to happen happens, then more people are going to, still be suffering. So no, that's not a good thing. But I do think there's merit in what you're saying, because for a lot of people, I think this election might be their last the last chance that they give the union to an extent, because we have had a Conservative government for well over a decade now, and if Labour fail to deliver the level of change that they are promising, then I would expect to see the support for independence begin to rise. And the thing that always frustrates me about this, and particularly, I suppose, more with Labour politicians and party members, is I actually think the unionist parties have the most to gain from independence, because it would allow Scottish Labour to actually be Scottish Labour without having to worry about what's being said or approved down in London. It would allow the Conservatives to sort of sever that toxic sort of connection or the muscle memory of Thatcher and all the rest of it. Whereas the minute Scotland becomes independent, the SNP served its purpose. That's what I think politics in Scotland could actually be really exciting and really hopeful, and that we would finally have a breakdown of parties who were making promises that they presuming they win the election, they would have the powers to either deliver on it or not deliver on it, and Scotland can get rid of them if they don't promise on it. So again, for me, independence is a hopeful thing rather than it being, a sort of native, or anything based on nationality.
I think, Mhairi, I accept the point about where independence is in terms of popular support, but where it is on people's list of priorities, it's slid right down people's list of priorities.
Absolutely.
Cost of living, the education system, healthcare, jobs, competitiveness. Those are the things that people are actually passionate about. And I think that's the fundamental miscalculation that the SNP have made recently. They continue to bang this drum about independence when people are saying, actually, hold on a minute here. Look at all the levers of power you've had for the last 17 years, and materially the country is worse off in terms of public services and also paying more in tax.
Right, but you say all the levers that you have. The biggest problem in Scottish society right now is poverty, and it has been for a long, long time. Now, the causes of poverty, namely the economy and social security, where does the vast majority of power for those two things lie? It's not in the Scottish Parliament, it's in Westminster.
But if you look
again, if you're wanting to transform people's lives, if you're wanting to really attack poverty, if you're wanting to benefit the economy for Scotland, then you're going to have to be talking about Brexit. Brexit's something Labour's not talking about.
But actually, it's about prioritisation. And I think if you look at, the UK economy has been too sluggish over the last decade. I'll hold my hands up to that. But the Scottish economy has underperformed a sluggish UK economy. Had it grown in line with the rest of the UK, the Scottish economy would be £10 billion better off. Yes, but this is a comparative with the rest of the UK, and we all left Europe at the same time. Fundamentally, the SNP government, particularly
Scottish productivity is ahead of English.
Particularly latterly,
as is the NHS and education.
Particularly latterly, the issue is that the Scottish government stopped speaking to Scottish business.
Well, Pam, let's come back to the sort of the bigger, longer range question, which is that what do you do about the 1 in 3 Labour supporters in Scotland who want independence?
Well, I think what they want ultimately is change, and I can understand why people are reaching for the fastest reset button that they think they can find. And many, for example, many young people may not have lived through a Labour government. And I fundamentally believe that the problems that the people in Scotland face are the same problems that people in the rest of the UK face. And if we make the change that the Labour Party say they will do, and I believe we will do, then I think people will see that change is possible within the current circumstances that we have. And Mhairi talks about reducing poverty, and I think that has to be a key part of whatever the next government do, which is why we have said that we would have a child poverty strategy.
But do you think people will change their minds?
Lift wages.
If you look at support for independence, it's been pretty solid, hasn't it? Around that sort of late 40s mark. Sometimes it's been a bit higher, sometimes it's gone a bit lower. But what it suggests is that on the constitutional question, people don't really change their minds that much. And what you're suggesting is a lot of people are going to suddenly change their minds because they've got a Labour government instead of a Conservative one.
I'm saying that they may see things differently. And if they can start to see the change in the country that they live in as a result of the political decisions that are taken, either at Westminster or in Holyrood, then I believe that they may be able to restore faith. Mhairi said earlier on that, the main purpose of the SNP is independence, and if an independent nation existed, they wouldn't need to exist. The purpose of the SNP right now should be to govern Scotland, and their failure to do so has caused a lot of pain and a lot of hurt in families across the country who are using sticking plasters to cover up for the failures of the SNP government as well as the Tory government.
Do you want to reply?
I disagree entirely, absolutely entirely. Well, I think, first off, this idea that, that a Labour government will fundamentally change things. Well, for example, would you get rid of the Internal Market Act, which has put a bulldozer right through the devolution settlement? Is that what this new relationship will look like? And when it comes to this idea of, and you're right, by the way, I think all political parties are guilty of putting the party before the public. But I've seen that firsthand from Labour MPs for 10 years, where they have spent more time in the lobbies with Conservatives than they have with SNP, and they then refuse to vote on something because it's an SNP motion, but then 2 weeks later they bring back one that's exactly the same. So this petty politics
But I think
is going to exist regardless of whether Labour are in charge
I'm
or
not sure that's the case.
It was.
I'm not saying that wasn't the case. You said petty politics will exist regardless. I'm saying I'm not sure that's the case. But I'll give you an example from the Scottish Parliament. I've been in the Scottish Parliament for 3 years now. I brought a bill to improve the transitions of young disabled people.
Yep.
And until the Butte House agreement collapsed and the government needed votes from other people and other parties, nobody spoke to us about anything.
I think there is an issue here, and this is going to be seen as sort of naked political opportunism, and I honestly don't want to come across as that, because it isn't. I mean, I was a journalist at Holyrood magazine when Parliament was first founded, and it was meant to be a new kind of politics. It was meant, the way we sit, the way that Scottish political discourse was meant to develop was not as it has. And I think the argument about who poisoned the well in Scottish politics, I hate to say, I do think it came from the nationalist cause only after the independence referendum, because I think at that point in time, you guys thought, we're that close, what do we need to do to get it over the line? And at that point in time, it was to create the monster of division. And if you create the monster of division, some people would topple you away. And I hate to say it, I agree with Pam, in Scottish Parliament, at various points, including during gender recognition reform, we brought forward some sensible, reasoned amendments, one on safe spaces that would have prevented the Isle of Bryson sort of situation developing in the future. I recognise that developed in any case, but fundamentally they wouldn't take them because they were Tory amendments. And I think that's where Scottish politics has got to. And I think that is why, up and down the country, a lot of people are now saying to us, look, can we just make the independence cause go away for a generation as it was promised, remarshal their arguments and come back another time and have that discussion?
I think that's nonsense, because this idea of this, monster of division, politics is divisive. It's people disagree. And this fundamentally, again, comes back to something that might and probably will bite the backside of a future Labour government, which is that when it comes to the Constitution of Scotland, both the Labour and Conservatives are singing from the same hymn sheet. And in actual fact, that's where a lot of the frustration and support for the SNP does come from. Regardless of the fact that half of Scotland for nearly a decade have been supporting independence, but that is constantly just ignored and swept aside, no matter what the electoral
Just even in terms
success
of language, I mean, some of your colleagues in Holyrood will talk about the Westminster parties, implying somehow that you delegitimise a political party because you apply the word Westminster to it.
No, but it's fair to point out that you are governed by the party in London.
No, we're not. But you sat in the House of Commons. I could equally have argued you were part of the Westminster elite for that period. Now, you left partly because of it.
Not London.
Well, the point is, there's a Scottish Labour Party, there's a Scottish Conservative Party. We determine our public policies, but you sought to poison the well by delegitimising other political rivals.
It's fair to point out there is no political party. There is no Scottish Conservative, Scottish Labour Party. They are all part of the UK-wide Conservative Party and Labour Party. There is no such thing as a Scottish Labour and Scottish Conservative.
Sitting in my inbox this afternoon is a Scottish manifesto being written and signed off by the Scottish Conservatives.
We can talk about people listening to someone in London or someone in Edinburgh. Actually, for the people whose doors I knock in Glasgow on a daily basis, Edinburgh and London are both as far out of reach from them as anywhere, because the governments of the day are not talking to them. They're not talking about issues that matter to them. And that's who we should be listening to, the public.
Yes, although we've got a classic case, with the two-child benefit cap, where Anas Sarwar is against it. Keir Starmer's the boss, and he said he'll keep it. So Anas Sarwar knuckles down and says, well, OK, we have to accept that in Scotland.
That's not quite the version That's not quite the version of what you will have heard us say yesterday, which was that we were right to oppose it. We are right to continue to campaign to abolish it. We're not going to promise something that we can't keep, but we have said that we will reform universal credit. We'll also, through the new...
I know that's your position, but in terms of the conversation you've just been having, you have an example of you're claiming to be a Scottish party, but the truth is it's the guys in London who told you what the policy is.
That's not the case, because what we've said, and actually Keir Starmer has also said this, and so have other members of the UK party, that it is something that we shouldn't have. We were right to oppose it, and when the time is right, they'll be able to take action on it. But fundamentally important, what we said and what we said we would do, would be reform universal credit. Two-child limit's not the only thing wrong with universal credit. There is a lot wrong with universal credit.
That's another podcast,
fixed.
but we'll leave that there. Now, we spent a lot of this podcast sort of projecting ahead and kind of assuming that we know what the result of the election is going to be based on where all the opinion polls are. But let's bring it a little bit shorter range. The next couple of weeks, how do you think they're going to unfold? Just in a minute each, Craig.
We're going to fight right up to the end in those seats that we're in contention, or the seats that we're targeting. And I hope that if we continue doing what we're doing, talking to the people on the doorsteps, talking about their priorities, that we can increase our representation here in Scotland come July the 4th.
Gosh, OK. Mhairi?
I think the next few weeks are probably going to feel like a few months, just judging by a lot of the events of this campaign. But look, I think ultimately it does come back to the fact of what you stated at the beginning. A lot of places are marginal. It's going to come down to the wire. And the biggest challenge for every party, but from personal experience for the SNP, is going to be making sure our support actually comes out to vote. Because one of the aspects of politics just now is that people are tired. You know, a lot has happened in the last 5-6 years. So it's, I suppose, trying to inspire people is what's going to be the main focus, I think.
Pam?
We have two options on July the 4th. We can wake up on July the 5th with more Tory government and Rishi Sunak back in number 10. I'd suggest we don't risk that and vote Labour on July the 4th.
Thank you all very much indeed. So, I mean, no matter how predictable you think the outcome of the election is, on the night of July the 4th, this is the place to look, because Scotland's election is right in the balance. That was the Political Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.